I've noticed that in practicing for the last 40 years that people keep getting fatter and sicker. And I think I understand why. It turns out that there's a hidden force at play, and that force is undermining people's ability to be healthy and to be happy. And it's largely unrecognized. And we call that force the pleasure trap because it involves the artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. So the more dopamine your brain secretes, the more pleasure or the more intense the pleasure that you experience is. And, this system of the brain rewarding the body when the body engages in behaviors that favor survival and reproduction has worked out quite well for humans and all the other animals that we share the planet with. The brain gets the body to do what it takes to get enough to eat, to avoid being eaten, and to live long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes and let the whole cycle continue. And the fact that we're still here suggests that that system has worked well for a millennium. But there's a bit of a problem that's come up, and that's that if you artificially stimulate dopamine production in the brain, you can actually become addicted to this artificial stimulation. And we recognize that, particularly when it comes to certain chemicals like cocaine, methamphetamines, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, et cetera. If you take these substances, they can make you feel good. But if you keep taking them, you can become addicted to the point where you have to keep taking them, not only to feel good, but to try to avoid feeling very bad. And withdrawal is kind of the hallmark of addiction. And we recognize that alcohol and cocaine and these substances can be very deceptive and very problematic. Cocaine, for example, if you compare how much dopamine is secreted when a person uses cocaine versus having an orgasm during sex, you see that there's 10 times as much dopamine secreted using cocaine as having an orgasm. You can imagine how reinforcing that substance can be. I remember one time I was in Los Angeles actually giving a talk on this topic, and an older woman, maybe her mid-80s, stood up in the audience and she said, "Excuse me, Dr. Goldhamer, where would I get cocaine from?" That's not actually the point, but what people don't recognize, they do recognize drugs, and they say, don't just say no and all that, and recognize that drugs are a major potential problem. What we don't recognize, though, often is that there are chemicals that can be added to the food supply that also artificially stimulate dopamine production in our brains. And these chemicals lead to systematic overfeeding. And those chemicals include salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not actually food. They're hyperconcentrated components from food that are added back to food that stimulate dopamine production in the brain to make foods taste good. And that's what tasting good means, essentially, is that the materials that you put in your mouth stimulate dopamine production in your brain. And if the substance you put in your mouth has artificially concentrated chemicals like salt, oil, and sugar, if they're higher in caloric density than you'd normally be exposed to, the brain will secrete more dopamine. Your brain is essentially designed for an environment of scarcity, where getting enough to eat and not getting eaten was the biological imperative of life. And so the higher the caloric density of a food, the more valuable your brain feels, because in that environment of scarcity, the only people that survive were the few that managed to get enough to eat and not get eaten. So when you put salt, oil, and sugar, these artificially concentrated substances in the diet, increasing its caloric density and stimulating more dopamine production, animals or people that get exposed to those substances will systematically overeat. For example, birds, given these chemicals, will get so fat they can't even fly. Rodents will increase their body weight 49% in 60 days. Now, these rats are getting fat not from psychological reasons. This isn't mommy rat didn't love them enough, or daddy rat loved them too much, or they had the stress of having to go to work. This is psychological, or excuse me, biological. This is the artificial stimulation of dopamine that comes from increased caloric density in the feed. And this pleasure trap is also effective in humans. Human beings that put these chemicals in their feed, the salt, oil, and sugar, will systematically overfeed. And the consequence of this chemicals is that they become overweight. So, for example, one of these chemicals we talk about is C6H12O6, which, as most of you recognize, is the chemical composition of sugar. Sugar has become so pervasive in society that the average person is eating somewhere around 150 pounds a year of this white powdery substance. When you think about it, I'm not eating any of it, which means somebody's eating my share as well. When the consequence of eating 150 pounds a year per person of this substance, which is high in caloric density but low in satiety feedback, is quite obvious. People overeat. Another chemical, CH3, CH27, CH, CH27, COOH, is also known as oil. And when we use oil, we do some particularly pernicious things with it. We heat it up at high temperature and then take perfectly healthy substances like potatoes and turn them into sponges, into grease sponges, where we soak up the grease, increasing caloric density several fold. I tell patients if they really want to have fried foods, what they should do is just find the deep fryer and stick their head in it and suck, because essentially that's what they're doing when they're eating those types of foods. Another chemical, another white powdery substance that's added to food is sodium chloride. Now, sodium is an essential nutrient. In very small dosages, it's absolutely critical. If you don't get enough sodium, you will die. The American Heart Association says people need around 500 milligrams of salt a day. However, the average American consumes 3,400 milligrams or more of sodium a day. So we're getting many, many times the amount of sodium that's necessary or advised. Now, some people are confused because sodium chloride has no calories, 0 calories. It's just sodium and chloride. So people ask, how is it possible that something with no calories can make someone fat? And the reason is that amongst its many effects, sodium also stimulates what's called passive overeating. So, for example, if you ask a human to eat a substance, say potatoes, until they're full, they'll eat a certain amount of potatoes. If you take that same person and give them potatoes that are salted, they will eat more potato before they reach satiety or before they feel full. And people will say, well, of course, because it makes it taste better. And that's absolutely true. It makes it taste better. And that's what tasting better means, is that the chemical stimulates more dopamine production in the brain, more pleasure. People will eat more before they naturally feel full. So that type of passive overeating results in consistently higher caloric intake than it would be if they're eating the whole natural foods without this chemical stimulation. Now, sodium also has a number of other properties which are detrimental. For one thing, if you think about it, sodium is a toxin in higher concentrations. In fact, if you take a tablespoon, it can act as an emetic. A larger quantity can actually, at some point, be fatal. So when you take more sodium than you need, the body will protect you to some degree from the effect of that sodium. One thing it does is it can bind it with calcium, which may be why people on high salt diets have higher incidence of osteoporosis. It also increases blood volume as the body holds more fluid to neutralize and keep things in appropriate proportion. And that increased blood volume increases blood pressure. And a significant percentage of people with high blood pressure or hypertension are what we call salt sensitive, that they're even better at holding salt than somebody else. And as a consequence, they're more vulnerable to the effects of high sodium intake as far as compromising their health. So in addition to making people fat, excess salt can also contribute to osteoporosis and also to high blood pressure and many other conditions, not the least of which involves the gut microbiome. So if you think about the fact is that we live synergistically with organisms like bacteria and fungi and viruses and different other animalcules. In fact, if you take a human being and you separate it into human cells versus non-human cells, things like bacteria and fungi, et cetera, there's actually more non-human cells making up the body than human cells. And you live hopefully in balance with these organisms, and they're an important part of your survival. For example, the gut microbiome contains over 1 trillion creatures, 1,000 different strains in a healthy person of organisms. And those organisms are, for example, just the ones that line your intestinal tract are thought to be around 5 pounds of creatures. That's a huge volume of microorganisms. And these are living creatures. They're swimming around in your gut. They're eating and drinking and defecating inside you. So you got 1 trillion creatures pooing in you right now. And what they poo in you could be nasty, toxic waste that includes things like TMA, which becomes trimethylamine oxidase, which is a highly toxic substance that contribute to heart disease and cancer, et cetera. Or they could be pooing potassium, or they could be pooing vitamin K, for example, which is an essential nutrient. So what determines whether your organisms are pooing toxic waste or fertilizer in you? Well, what you feed them. If you feed them meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, and other animal products, you will have completely different organisms than if you're eating a plant-based diet. And those organisms will have completely different waste products. So to a large extent, what you put in your mouth is going to determine what type of organisms are living in your gut and on your body, and what kind of waste products you're going to be exposed to. One of the common medical treatments is the use of antibiotics. And although antibiotics can be helpful when a certain strain of organisms have kind of become dominant in your microflora, antibiotics are not that discerning, and so they tend to wipe out large amounts of all kinds of organisms, and that can disrupt your microbiome and the balance of these organisms living together to keep you healthy. And so antibiotics can have some detrimental effects when used excessively or inappropriately. So as far as the microbiome is concerned, think about how sodium might affect the microbiome. In fact, when you think about salt, we use it as a preservative, don't we? If you salt meat or other substances, and it keeps the microbiome balance from allowing that meat to go bad as quickly, to spoil. And so you can imagine a high sodium diet could have a profound effect on these 1 trillion creatures that are living in your digestive system. And in fact, it is thought to do exactly that it can alter the type of organisms and how those organisms function. So salt intake in the diet, although may be very appealing, can be quite detrimental. And not the least of which, as I said, involves systematic overfeeding and the resulting obesity. For example, potatoes on their own have 500 calories a pound. If you fill up the human stomach with potatoes, you get it takes about 500-600 calories. then you're just mechanically full. But if you take those potatoes and soak them in grease and add salt, oil, and sugar, you get something called potato chips, which have 5 times the caloric density as the core potatoes. And so with 5 times caloric density, you get much more dopamine stimulation. And your brain, as far as your brain's concerned, that makes it tasty because it's got higher caloric density. It's got these substances. And if you become conditioned to eating very high caloric density foods like potato chips, they say, bet you can't just eat one. Well, they're not kidding. Your brain is going to drive you to that behavior. And if you try to shift back to eating healthier foods with a more natural caloric density, something like broccoli has 150 calories a pound, as far as your brain's concerned, all it wants to know is where are the chips. Well, the consequence of this revolutionary dietary change has resulted in a situation where 75% of people living in industrialized societies are now overweight or obese, which means if you're not overweight, you're abnormal. You don't want to be normal. You want to be healthy, and healthy people are not overweight because the consequences of being overweight, as we're going to learn, is devastating. So the biological imperative of life is get enough to eat and live long enough to reproduce. So it's not surprising that anytime the brain gets the body to do these primary behaviors that allow us to get enough to eat and live long enough so we can reproduce, the body's rewarded. The brain rewards the body with dopamine. So it's not surprising that the normal natural stimulants of dopamine, that neurochemical associated with pleasure, are food and sex. Food and sex, food and sex, food and sex are the normal natural stimulants of dopamine. Unless you are a male, then it's entirely different. But whether it's food and sex or sex and food that's driving our behavior, the reality is those natural normal stimulants have allowed our species, and for that matter, the other species that we share the planet with, to survive and thrive. Modern human beings, at least people that we would recognize as ourselves, have been around 300,000 years. If you go back farther than that, things were a bit different. But for the last 300,000 years, people that have walked on this planet, modern humans, would have looked much like us, could have reproduced with us. Over the last 300,000 years, anthropologists tell us that the brain of the human, the brain that drives the whole show, has not substantially changed. That the brain in your head today is essentially the same brain that was in the head of a human 300,000 years ago. The question is, why have things changed so much between now and then? For example, now we have 75% of people who are overweight or obese, whereas in a natural setting, eating a natural diet, there's virtually no obesity. There's, and very rare to have the diseases of dietary excess, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and even cancer. And you want to ask yourself, what's changed? If our brain hasn't changed, what has changed? The brain still produces dopamine to favor behaviors that favor survival and reproduction. The more dopamine, the more pleasure. This has been well documented. So what's really changed is the environment. Modern humans evolved in an environment of scarcity. And in order for our genes to survive and thrive, our brains direct our bodies to engage in these very specific behaviors that in that setting favored survival and reproduction. And this went on for 299,800 years. And then about 200 years ago, just a very brief blip in biological time, the Industrial Revolution came about as a consequence of the tremendous innovation of human beings, using our large bulbous neuronal net called the brain to change our environment. Our brains are huge. In fact, our brains are our biggest burner of glucose. And as a consequence of these brains, we've been able to develop tremendous skill sets, not the least of which with the Industrial Revolution was changing how we dealt with food. We began to take agricultural products that came around, 10, 12,000 years ago and begin to process them. And so we began to change dramatically the nature of the food that we ate. For example, caloric density, in other words, calories per pound, as I mentioned, is very important to the brain. The brain, trying to get enough to eat, would value higher caloric density foods. Salad, for example, has 100 calories per pound. Well, a human being on average needs around 2,000 calories a day in order to survive. So if you were to try to live on salad, you'd have to eat 20 pounds of salad a day. And if you started eating salad at sunrise and you didn't stop eating until sunset, do you think you could eat 20 pounds of salad? I don't think so. And neither does your brain. And your brain's not stupid. So when you give your brain access to 100 caloric density foods like salad, it says, fine, I'll eat the salad until real food comes along, because your brain knows it is not going to survive eating salad alone. Fruit, on the other hand, has 300 calories a pound, 3 times the caloric density of salad. Because of its higher sugar content, it has a higher caloric density. So fruit tastes better to us than salad, because tasting better means that when you put fruit in your mouth, your brain perceives the higher caloric density and produces more dopamine to reward you. Because although, you still need 7 pounds of fruit a day to survive, at least it's physiologically or biologically possible. You could do it. I mean, it would still be a full-time job, but at least it could be done. If you increase the caloric density of the food, largely with the advent of cooking, potatoes, rice, and beans, for example, have about 500 calories per pound serving. So you would only need about 4 pounds of these foods in order to be able to survive. And so if you're hungry, it's likely you'd rather have potatoes, rice, and beans than salad, because your brain will give you more dopamine. It will taste better to you. And of course, will favor survival. But what if we invented new foods, post-industrial revolution, that increased caloric density? What if we could invent a food, for example, that instead of having 500 calories a pound, had 1,500 calories a pound? Do you think it would result in more dopamine stimulation? Therefore, would people like it better? And I don't know, what if we called that food ice cream and we introduced it at the World's Fair? Do you think it would get rave reviews? Now, ice cream is an interesting substance. It doesn't appear in nature. You've never slipped on the ice cream or fallen in an ice cream pond. It takes a little bit of tricky manufacturing in order to produce it, actually. And if you take ice cream and you warm it up to room temperature and you eat it, it's described as sickly sweet. It's so sweet that it makes you sick. And yet, it has the same amount of sickening sugar when it's cold. The difference is it tastes great, because when it's artificially cold, like ice cream, it fools your satiety mechanisms. Your taste buds are not designed to accurately detect sweet in a substance like that, because, as I said, it doesn't exist in nature. And as a consequence, when you have to super saturate ice cream in order for you to detect the sugar, because you don't detect sweet well when something's very cold, just the way your taste buds work. So when they super saturate ice cream with sugar, it tastes great, unless you warm it up to room temperature and taste it, and then it's sickly sweet. It makes you just as sick when it's cold, but you don't know it, because you're fooling your natural taste mechanisms. Now, what if we wanted a food with a higher caloric density, that is a higher calories per pound, than ice cream? Do you think people would like that? Do you think they would call it the staff of life? And sure enough, bread has 1,500 calories per pound. And the reason is, if you take wheat berries, which boiled would only have 500 calories a pound, but you grind it into a powder, and then you add salt, oil, and sugar to it, you get something with 3 times the caloric density, which is 1,500 calories a pound. And that's before you turn it into a butter boat and spread coagulated cow pus all over it, which increases caloric density even further. Now, if you take bread and you withdraw the salt, oil, and sugar, as well as the yeast, you end up with something that's called matzah. And matzah is punishment on Passover. And people aren't tending to get fat eating matzah because what they're doing is they're using the wheat and water as a carrier agent to drive the sugar, oil, fat, and salt to your palate. The same thing happens with beef, for example. If you just take beef and boil it, people aren't that hot to be gnawing on boiled beef. On the other hand, if you use beef as a carrier agent to carry the salt and the sauces and the other material to your palate, usually by a trained professional called a chef, which is trained on how to use salt, oil, and sugar and deliver it to the palate using a limited number of often federally subsidized stable foods, you end up with a bit of a problem. So, have you ever been in a restaurant and you notice that they have a basket of bread right there on the table and it's hot and steamy? You know, your brain smells that and thinks, oh, baby, give it to me. And you have a piece or 2 or 3, don't you? And pretty soon you notice that the bread in the basket is completely gone. There's no more bread. And so you push that naked basket to the edge of the table and you wait for the waiter or waitress to come around in order to notice that. And finally they do, and they look at your empty basket and they say to you, oh, did you want some more bread? Now, the first thing you have to do is pretend like you didn't know that the basket was empty. And you look at the basket and you say, oh, sure, why not? But what you're really thinking is, do they want a tip or not? And they bring you some more bread. You may even have some more of that. But you never go into that restaurant and say, excuse me, waiter, could you please bring me 3 large baked potatoes? Because I'd like to eat those potatoes before I order my dinner. You don't order and eat 3 large baked potatoes before you order your dinner because 3 potatoes would have about 500 calories, would physically fill up your entire stomach. And there'd be no room left for greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh processed foods that the restaurant features. On the other hand, if you fill up your stomach with bread, that same 500 calories of bread, that only takes about 1/3 of the stomach to get 500 calories of bread. So there's plenty of room left to fill up other materials. When you think about this, it's a rather startling, but bread with 1,500 calories a pound is only slightly less than pure sugar at 1,800 calories a pound. Now, I bet many of you do not go into restaurants and take that sugar that's on the table. You notice they have that little basket of packets of sugar. And I'll bet you don't take 11 of those baskets, crack them open, and just eat them. Now, you might say, well, why not? It's free. The sugar is so cheap, they don't even have to charge for it. But you don't do that because it kind of sounds disgusting. On the other hand, many of you have had one of those small sodas, the old style that used to have, 9 or 12 ounces in it, which has somewhere around 11 teaspoons of sugar in it. And you don't think too much of that. In fact, that used to be a special treat, but now we've got the big gulp, the super big gulp, the double gulp, and the express gulp with free refills. And I think pretty soon, just getting a soda pop at your local fast food is going to be where chiropractors get most of their business from having to carry the things out of the restaurant. I'm pretty soon to get a soda pop, you're going to need a bucket. It's startling to know that teenagers in the United States, that up to 25% of their total caloric load now comes from the sugar in soda pop alone, not just sugar, but just in sugar sweetened beverages. But we do not know why they're getting so fat and getting sick and developing what used to be called adult onset diabetes at a younger age. It's just a complete mystery. What's the problem? What if we wanted to go even further and we wanted to come up with a substance that had even higher caloric density? Instead of 1,800 calories a pound, we wanted to go to 2,500 calories a pound. Do you think people would like that? Something that had 25 times the caloric density of salad. Do you think it would taste 25 times better because it would result in so much more dopamine stimulation? And what if we called that substance chocolate? Do you think that people would like that? If you took 1,000 people from 1,000 cultures and you blindfolded them and you gave them a mouthful of salad and a mouthful of chocolate, do you think they could tell the difference? I tell patients, if instead of eating chocolate and suffering the consequences, what they should do is melt it down and then rub it all over their belly and their hips where it's going to end up. And that way, when they're done, they can wash it off instead of carrying it around all week. There was a survey done. This was a survey of just women, not men. And they asked these women, would you rather have mad, hot, passionate sex or eat chocolate? And the two most common responses were what kind of chocolate and how many pieces are we talking about? So we know now why people are getting fat. And we understand that being overweight is not just an aesthetic problem, but it's a major health concern. For about 10% of the fat on your body, when you have excess fat, is called visceral fat. And visceral fat is the fat that tends to accumulate around your abdomen and around your organs, compared to subcutaneous fat, which is normal fat storage in the rest of the body. The problem with visceral fat is it's hypertrophic, it's hyperplastic, and it's hypermetabolic. So it affects you profoundly. Essentially, it's acting like a tumor. So if you have 2 pounds of visceral fat, for example, it's essentially like having a 2-pound tumor in your belly. And if you went up to a person and said, look, you have a 2-pound tumor and it's giving off metabolic products that's increasing your risk for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease, they would be very concerned and might even do something about it. Well, if you have extra fat on your body, it's likely you have excess visceral fat that is essentially acting like a tumor. And it's going to be important to get rid of that. It's a consequence of the pleasure trap. You've been fed with these chemicals, whether it's you or a rat or a mouse or a bird, are fed with these chemicals that include salt, oil, and sugar. And the consequence is you eat too much, you get fat, you get visceral fat. The visceral fat acts like a tumor, giving off inflammatory products and is associated with heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, and some forms of cancer. Now, what's interesting about those conditions, which are the leading contributing causes of death and disability, is that they're treated as if they're completely unrelated and independent conditions, and they're not. But today, you have to go to a different kind of doctor even to be diagnosed and treated for these conditions. The doctor that diagnoses heart disease is a completely different specialty than the one that diagnoses diabetes or the one that treats autoimmune diseases, because they're treated as if they're independent, unrelated conditions. And one of the things that's interesting about those conditions and the doctors that treat them, if you go to them, they will say, oh, you have high blood pressure. Here is 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 5 different kinds of medications that we're going to give you. Now, these medications have side effects like chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and actually even premature death, which is why we don't give everybody high blood pressure medications, even though 60% of people are hypertensive by the time they reach 60. We don't just put it in the public water supply, because those drugs have very serious side effects and dangers, including death. And in fact, if you give high blood pressure medication to people that don't have high enough levels of hypertension, you will actually kill more people from the medication than you save from slightly reducing their risk of stroke. Because it turns out high blood pressure medications, for example, do not reduce the risk of heart attack, but they do slightly reduce the risk of stroke. But if you don't wait till people's blood pressure is high enough, the death rate from taking the drugs is higher than the save rate from reducing stroke, which is why you wait to treat people with those medications. So this pleasure trap is very insidious, because if you go to the doctor for high blood pressure, they will say, take these drugs with all their side effects, and they will promise you that if you take them exactly as prescribed, you'll never get well. Your doctor will say, you'll be on these drugs the rest of your life, and we promise you, you will be sick forever. You'll either die from the consequences of the medication or the consequences of the cardiovascular disease, because it will not prevent that disease from progressing. If you go to a different doctor to treat diabetes, they will tell you the same thing. Oh, you have diabetes. It's associated with all of these terrible problems: diabetic neuropathy, retinopathy, heart disease, etc. We're going to give you these medications that will not reduce insulin resistance, but will force blood sugar across the membrane for a while. And if you take these drugs, you'll never get well, and you'll be on these drugs the rest of your life. If you go to the doctor for autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, asthma, eczema, psoriasis, etc., these are conditions where the body immune system is attacking itself. They will give you medications that are very powerful to shut down the immune system. And at first, it'll be like a dream. And then it may become a nightmare, because it turns out you need your immune system. And when you shut it off, you increase dramatically the risks of developing, for example, even more serious problems like cancer. It's interesting to think about autoimmune diseases and cancer as two sides of the same coin. That in cancer, the immune system is not working well enough to keep the cancer cells that form every day at bay. So, you're forming cancer cells, you're getting mutations, and you're getting senescent cells, and your body's immune system is going in there and trying to eat those things up and recycle them through a process called autophagy. And if autophagy keeps up as fast as you're forming these older cells and cancerous mutations, you basically do okay. But if their cancerous cells are forming faster than you can eat them up, you start growing tumors, and then you get cancer and metastasis and ultimately die, often from a slow and painful death. So the immune system not working well enough may be associated with cancer. On the other hand, if their immune system is overactive, if you overstimulate the immune system in order, for example, to treat cancer, one of the consequences is often getting autoimmune disease, where the immune system is too active and begins to attack itself. Depending on which tissue is being attacked depends on which name we give to the autoimmune disease. If your body's immune system is attacking your thyroid cells, you may end up with the most common cause of hypothyroidism, which is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. That's your immune system attacking your thyroid. In fact, it's interesting that the HLA-DQ gene associated with Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the same gene that's been associated with gluten sensitivity. And one of the theories is that when you take genetically vulnerable people and give them access to gluten, the protein in wheat, rye, and barley, the immune system can begin to attack itself. In some people, it shows up as celiac disease. About 1% of the population, the intestinal tract is attacked by the immune system. And if you don't avoid wheat, rye, and barley, it will be very serious and potentially fatal. In other people, though, the immune system doesn't attack the intestinal tract, but rather attack the thyroid gland, and it's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. In other people, they have symptoms where the immune system is attacking soft tissues or joints, and they have arthritis, or they have vasculitis, or they have psoriasis or eczema or other conditions like asthma, et cetera. So lots of different names for basically a similar process, which is where your immune system is attacking your own tissues. So, and again, doctors will give you drugs, but tell you basically there's no cure. You have to just take these drugs the rest of your life. And once you're caught in the pleasure trap, excuse me, it is very difficult to escape. In fact, most people cannot escape pleasure traps, whether it's drug addiction or whether it's addiction to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in your brain from chemicals added to your food. For example, alcohol. We know that alcohol is addictive, and people that have become addicted to alcohol, we call them alcoholics. And if an alcoholic decides they want to try to break free of the addiction to alcohol, and they go to an inpatient program for 30 days, they may spend $40,000 or $50,000 to do that. And then they go to 90 visits in 90 days to a 12-step program. And they are fortunate enough to have family support. The likelihood that they will be drinking again within just 12 months is 82%. That's the most successful treatment that's been objectified. Normally, treatment failure rates are somewhere around 90%, but at least 82% of those people will be back drinking alcohol within a year. If you're a heroin addict and you go to court-mandated detox program and are told that you have to stop using heroin or they'll put you in jail, about 90% of heroin addicts will be shooting heroin again within just 12 months. But what's even more interesting is if you go to a doctor and say, doctor, help me lose some weight, and I'd like to keep that weight off, say 5% of my body weight for 1 year, the likelihood that you will fail is 95%. So there's a smaller success rate than there is for alcohol or drug addiction. And what's even more startling is if your BMI is over 40, this says 30, it's supposed to be 40. But if your BMI is over 40, the likelihood that a male will be able to ever successfully achieve and maintain a healthy weight is 1 male per 1,290 subjects. And if you're a female, it's 1 per 667 subjects. So there's a 99.9% failure rate. It's startling when you think about it, but a heroin addict is more likely to succeed than a person looking to lose weight. And we'll talk about why that might be. But first, let's take a look at what percentage of Americans exhibit the following healthy lifestyle characteristics. These are some of the most basic health lifestyle characteristics. For example, people are sufficiently active. Now, that doesn't mean they're an Olympic athlete. This just means that they engage in some aerobic activity on a regular basis, so walking, hiking, biking, dancing. That they're a non-smoker. Turns out smoking is one of the most effective ways of shortening your life that we have available as far as behavioral characteristics. Takes many years off life on average, causes all kinds of problems like smoker's face, where you get premature cross-linkaging of tissue. They're called wrinkles from the oxidative damage that comes from the smoking. What's interesting about smoking is that it actually may help you avoid dying from lung cancer. Did you know that? That smoking can actually help save you from dying from lung cancer. And the way that it does that is smoking causes so much oxidative damage to the enamel lining of the blood vessels that smokers often die from heart attacks or strokes before they live long enough to grow their lung tumors. And so in that way, by killing you from a heart attack and stroke earlier, it saves you from developing lung cancer later. I wonder if they made smoking more dangerous so everybody had a heart attack early, if they'd be allowed to advertise it as being cancer safe. So you're sufficiently active, you don't smoke, and you eat what the American Heart Association says is a healthy diet, not necessarily what you or I might think. That is, not advocating an exclusively whole plant food, SOS-free diet, but just a diet that has, the lean meats and the less toxic, less concentrated refined carbohydrates, and has a recommended body fat percentage. If you're a female, less than 25% of your entire body is made up of fat. And if you're a male, less than 20% of your entire body is made up of fat. Now, that is not being heroin addict thin. That's just being relatively lean. What percentage of Americans do you suppose meet these 4 most basic healthy lifestyle characteristics? Well, it turns out it's 2.7%. So that means 97.3% of people do not do even that, which means you may not know anybody that does even that, or if you do, it's probably a small percentage of the people that you come in contact with every day. Now, what's interesting is this is a map, for example, that shows self-reported obesity among adults. And you'll notice that the West Coast isn't quite as fat as the East Coast. As we move east, people tend to get fatter. On the West Coast, somewhere between 25 and 35% of people have achieved the exalted state of obesity. Whereas as we go east, the numbers increase from 35 to 45% obesity. Now, there are 3 states that are competing in an aggressive competition right now. They are West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And as you can see, they have achieved 45% to 50% obesity saturation, but nobody in the United States has yet broken that 50% goal to where they could have the majority of people, the entire population of the state, having achieved clinical obesity. That is at least 30 pounds overweight if you're a 5'4" individual. Now, the people at the Center for Disease Control that collect this data are what you call optimists, and I can prove that. You notice that nobody's achieved 50% or more obesity saturation, but the people from the CDC are so confident in the power of the American people that they've put it here on the chart. They know that at any moment, one of these 3 states is going to have a major breakthrough and finally have achieved majority obesity. Now, what's startling is that this is said to underreport obesity by at least 40%. And the reason why this appears to underreport obesity is because it is self-reported. And it turns out people lie. And they always lie saying they're thinner than they are, and they never lie saying they're fatter than they are. There's only one state left in the entire country that's obesity saturation is less than 25%. So it means this state has the smallest number of overeaters in the country or the largest number of liars. And the only state with less than 25% obesity self-reported is Washington, D.C. Now, I'll let you decide, are they smaller overeaters or bigger liars? Because I'm apolitical, which means I hate everyone. 93% of all the calories consumed in the United States today come from animal foods or highly processed pleasure trap chemicals. So meat, fish, fowl, eggs and dairy products, oil, salt, sugar, and refined carbohydrates. That means 7% of calories only come from fruits and vegetables. That means that fruits, and actually of that 7%, a third of it are potatoes, and potatoes are mostly served as French fries or potato chips. It means that whole plant foods no longer make a statistically significant percentage of the diet of many people living in the United States. They are the decoration on the plate. In fact, ketchup is considered the vegetable of your kid's school lunch program. The consequence of this dietary pattern has led us to specific leading causes of death. They are heart disease, diabetes, cancer, etc. Now, these diseases I mentioned used to be rare. They were called the diseases of kings because it was only the wealthy elite kings that could get the hyper-processed foods, obesity, and the visceral fat that are necessary to cause them. But what we do in our society is we wait for people to get one of these leading causes of death, and then we divert huge amounts of resources to treating these diseases with approaches that unfortunately have little effect on all-cause mortality or morbidity. We don't necessarily make people live longer or better with our treatments. Things like bypass surgeries and stents and very powerful drugs with serious side effects that have little effect on all-cause mortality. In fact, in the United States, we spend 2 or more times more than anybody else on healthcare, but our outcomes are towards the bottom of the pile. So we're not doing very well because we spend our money waiting for people to get sick and then treating them with treatments that unfortunately are doomed to failure, rather than treating the actual causes of death. That is the reason people get heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. And the reason people actually get those diseases, the actual causes of death, are the use of tobacco, the drinking of alcohol, including red wine, or as I call it, cancer juice, and eating a diet based on refined carbohydrates that include oil, salt, and sugar, and animal foods, as well as physical inactivity. So if we were to put our resources into helping people get rid of the actual causes of death, like drinking, smoking, lack of exercise, and eating a diet based on sugar, oil, salt, and animal foods, I believe we could dramatically reduce the incidence and delay the onset of these diseases of dietary excess so that people would have good lives and then good deaths where they reach their genetic potential, go to sleep, and don't wake up, rather than spending the last decade or two of their life unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed, waiting for people to come and change their diaper. But that's not what we're currently doing. What we're currently doing is selling people health food. So health food stores sell people olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate and coffee products and coconut products, diet sodas, white meat, low-fat dairy products, and advocate the Atkins paleo, high-fat, high-protein, low-carbohydrate type diets under the illusion that any short-term gain is going to be associated with long-term health benefit. In fact, I had the owners of a Whole Food Markets before it was purchased for $16 billion by Amazon at our facility. And I made a comment that 95% of the food at Whole Foods Market had nothing to do with Whole Foods, and probably 95% of the profit had nothing to do with Whole Foods. And the owner objected, saying that wasn't true, that it was probably closer to 99%, and that we should have a different attitude about it because it's the people buying the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, sugar, alcohol, and chocolate that are responsible, that if it wasn't for them, there would be no Whole Foods, that they're responsible for all the profit. And so now when I go into a Whole Foods store and I see people filling up on health compromising products, I actually go over and thank them for their support. What I think we should be doing instead of lying to people and selling them, quote, health food is encouraging people to consume healthy foods. And you notice health foods and healthy foods have nothing to do with each other. Healthy foods are fruits and vegetables, whole grains that are minimally processed, beans, nuts, and seeds, a diet that's whole plant foods, free of added salt, oil, and sugar, or a vegan SOS-free diet. I don't like plant-based as much as I like whole plant food, because plant-based just means it's based on plants, but could include all kinds of other substances. But an exclusively whole plant food diet, free of added salt, oil, and sugar, is a diet that will give you the quantity and quality of foods you need, but help you avoid the dietary pleasure trap, the chemicals, the salt, oil, and sugar that artificially stimulate dopamine production and result in overeating, that result in obesity and the diseases of dietary excess. And that's why you can be on a vegan diet, but be very unhealthy, because vegan just means no animal foods. There's lots of foods that are vegan, Oreo cookies and soda pop and alcohol, et cetera, that can be very health compromising, but they are free of animal foods. So what I'm suggesting is we eat an exclusively whole plant food diet, free of added salt, oil, and sugar, that we get adequate amounts of sleep so that you go to bed and can wake spontaneously feeling refreshed, and that you don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed each night. Now, by not eating in the 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed at night, that can have a profound benefit on your sleep. You can empty your bladder, not have to wake up as much. It can mean that the calories you eat are not having to be converted into fat because the calories you eat when you're active are able to be burned rather than stored. And that you're going to have a period of somewhere between 12 and 16 hours every day of fasting. And that fasting, as we'll learn in my next talk dealing with fasting, can have a profound effect on health promotion and health prevention. Even intermittent fasting, that 12 hours a day or up to 16 hours a day. You go to 16 hours a day if you delay breakfast a little bit, where you do some exercise in the morning before you eat. So that period of 12 to 16 hours a day is thought to induce changes cumulatively that are quite beneficial. You can compound those changes even further with longer periods of fasting, as we'll discuss and talk about. What that means is that you're getting 7 to 8 hours of good quality sleep each night, and you're eating over a period of 8 hours a day. And during that 8 hours a day, by limiting your feeding window, you also reduce the tendency to overeat, particularly if you're sticking exclusively to whole plant foods. And as a consequence, you can reverse the obesity and reverse the disease of dietary excess, particularly if you incorporate the third component here, which is exercise. That means walking, hiking, biking, swimming, a variety of exercises that will build strength, flexibility, and endurance. If you do all of those things, get a diet, get appropriate sleep, and get appropriate exercise, what ends up happening is you lose weight, you lose fat as well as visceral fat, and reverse the diseases of dietary excess. Now, not everybody loses weight at the same rate. Some people lose weight very rapidly. Some people lose weight very slowly. There are some people in our society that biologically lose weight very slowly. Those people are called women. Women, essentially, the female species, the only part of our species that are capable of reproducing, by the way, have to store fat to survive a period of biological vulnerability called pregnancy. And so healthy women will have a higher percentage of their body made up of fat. They'll have higher fat storage because during pregnancy, they go through this biological vulnerability that makes it more difficult to get enough to eat and survive. And higher fat storage is highly desirable. It's also necessary for the female hormone balance, et cetera, requires a higher fat intake. And so if you happen to be one of those people that are vulnerable to weight gain, that is, if you happen to be a woman, that means you're going to have differences than a man. A woman is full of estrogen, which is a fat storage hormone. Men are full of testosterone, which is a fat burning hormone. That's why if you injected women with enough testosterone, their fat would melt off them. But, they'd get hairy and get cancer and die. So it's probably not a good strategy for weight management. If you injected men with estrogen, they would get fat. They would grow breasts and get hips. These differences between men and women are largely biological, not psychological. But what that means is if you're a woman, is you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half the results. And that's just how it is. There's nothing we can do to change that biology. So get used to it. It's probably not just with weight loss. It's other things as well. Okay. So what does it look like? Fresh fruits, whether it's raw or cooked vegetables, grains, preferably grains that are low in gluten or free from gluten. So we avoid typically wheat, rye, and barley, particularly for those people that are gluten sensitive. Beans, there's a variety of different beans. Raw nuts and seeds, adequate water intake, a whole plant food diet free of added salt, oil, and sugar. So a vegan, SOS-free diet. Now that's exactly the types of foods that people ate for most of the 300,000 years that we've been on the planet. We ate whole foods. We did not eat refined carbohydrates because they didn't exist. They didn't exist until about 200 years ago when the diet began to change and we started doing more refined carbohydrates and ultra processed foods to the point where now 70% of calories of the average person is ultra processed foods. And so again, I don't eat any of it, which means somebody's also eating my share as well. Now, keep in mind, we've only eaten this kind of diet for the last couple hundred years, increasingly and progressively. And it's only been in the last couple hundred years that overweight and obesity has become a dominant factor. It's almost like there's a connection. Now, I want you to look at the next picture, which is going to compare our traditional diet to our current diet. And I want you to tell me, can you spot any difference? Because the difference between eating this traditional diet and our current diet is the reason people are getting fat, having visceral fat, producing the inflammation that causes heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and autoimmune diseases. Now, I have a very, very radical suggestion. Now, radical, remember, comes from the word radicus, which means root or cause. And my radical suggestion is we go back from eating this kind of food, which we've eaten only the last 200 years, to eating this kind of food, which we ate for almost 300,000 years. And when we've done that in practice, we've done that at the TrueNorth Health Center for the last 40 years. We've done it with over 25,000 patients. What we've noticed consistently is people lose weight. If they're a male and eating this diet, they lose 3 pounds a week, 150 pounds a year rate. If it's a woman, it's about 2 pounds a week, about 100 pounds a year rate. And shockingly enough, we've been able to prove that they can reverse the diseases of dietary excess. Their blood pressure normalizes, their blood glucose normalizes, they're able to get off their blood pressure and diabetes medications. Their autoimmune diseases often come under control where you can eliminate the powerful steroid medications, painkillers. And interestingly enough, even some forms of cancers reverse themselves. Tumors go down. We'll talk more about that in my next talk, dealing with fasting and its consequences. But this type of dietary change is a very powerful disease reversing process, and it's also a health promoting process. People that go back to eating these diets not only are able to overcome their obesity and diseases, but they're able to sustain long-term health. And I got examples now of patients that, with 40-year follow-ups. In fact, I talk about my mother, who, when she was 92 years old, mentioned that she had outlived all 50 of her lifelong friends. They had all died, including the ones that used to make fun of her mercilessly for her eating her son's crazy diet. And she said it was getting more and more difficult for her as she aged because all of her friends were dead, and it was getting harder and harder to make new friends because people even 10 years or 15 years younger than her were too old and sick to do the things she liked to do in terms of walking or playing bridge or whatever it was she was interested in. The people were too old and debilitated. And so she said to me, Alan, you have to warn your patients, if they're going to insist on eating this type of diet and engaging in this type of lifestyle, make younger friends. And she said, not just a little younger, a lot younger. Or pick a few friends that are health conscious. So at the end, there'll be people left to interact with. So what I've said is that health results from healthful living. And healthful living involves the use of diet, sleep, and exercise. That if you're willing to engage in radical behavioral changes, adopt a health-promoting diet that's vegan, SOS-free, you can reverse the diseases of dietary excess and promote long health, that you can likely have a healthy life expectancy and also a good end of life where instead of spending years debilitated, you reach your genetic potential and go to sleep and don't wake up. What I'd like to do right now is take time to answer any questions that might be related to this content.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldhamer. Excuse me. So now we're going to begin our Q&A portion. I guess the best way to get in contact with you have up on the screen right now is TrueNorthHealth.com.
Yes, in fact, I just will mention that we do have an interesting free service for your listeners. If people go to our website there and complete what are called the registration forms, which gets us information on their medical history, I offer a free phone conversation where we were happy to review your history and talk to you about, if this dietary approach or the use of fasting is relevant to you, try to point you in the right direction. We have an active telemedicine practice where people can contact doctors who are not idiots and engage with them anywhere in the world. And we have a facility, the TrueNorth Health Center, where for people interested in things like fasting or controlled dietary intervention, they can come and spend time with us where we can help them implement that. So there's a lot of resources, including a free phone conversation if they go to the website and fill out those registration forms.
All right. I just put that on my to-do list. So you'll I look forward to will the one-on-ones be with you?
Yes, it will. I'm happy to do that, and I spend a lot of time talking to people about trying to point them in the right direction.
All right, awesome. Well, I look forward to that. Um so you said a lot of very interesting things. All right, I've spoken to you in the past about fasting, as well as this topic, and it's both. You're so informative on both these things. So I'm gonna, got a list of questions that I want to go through real quickly. So with regard to, so you have SOS. I just want to clarify something. So that's salt, oil, and sugar, or sugar,
Yeah.
oil, and salt, whichever.
Yes, it's the chemicals added to food that make people fat, sick, and miserable.
Okay, perfect. And now what about things like nuts and seeds? So you have no problem with that?
So the problem with nuts, seeds, avocado, coconut is they're just very rich. And so you want to be aware. You don't want to just eat if you ate nothing but nuts or seeds, it would be a very high fat diet, high caloric density diet. So what we advocate for most people with nuts and seeds is doing some portion control there. If they're using nuts or seeds, we recommend up to an ounce a day, and preferably some nuts like walnuts and flax and seeds like flax seeds and hemp and the rest happen to be really high in omega-3 fatty acids. For a lot of people in our society, that's a real benefit, trying to shift the ratio of omega-3 fatty acids increase to offset some of the things that they really shouldn't be eating. And so we encourage people to use an ounce a day of those substances. If you get into doing too much of that, that may slow down your rate of weight loss. So you just want to be careful not to get eat those rich foods with abandon. Just do some portion control. For avocado, again, we're talking about a quarter to half an avocado a day, not, big piles of guacamole.
Okay, so half an avocado a day. So I just want to make sure that, like, cumulatively, you could have a quarter to half an avocado a day
Mhm.
alongside of an ounce of nuts
Yes.
and
And
an
that's
ounce.
going to get you to around 15 to 18% of calories from fat, which is a little bit higher than the very, very low fat diets that are advocated for cardiovascular disease reversal, and significantly less than the amount of fat that's in the standard American diet. But what we found is that around 15 to 80% of calories from fat kind of is the best of both worlds. It reverses cardiovascular disease. It helps people that are dealing with health compromises, but it also provides enough fat so people don't get some of the side effects of very low fat diets where they get dry skin or have other problems with DHA, et cetera. So, it's a compromise. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not some people that might benefit from lowering their fat even further, at least for a period of time to deal with specific conditions. But this is a health promoting diet that's sustainable by the vast majority of people. It's sufficient to help people that are overweight lose weight and help people that are underweight maintain optimum weight.
Okay, and all right. So now, so just want to get the whole cumulative. So quarter to a half, an avocado, 1 ounce of nuts, and 1 ounce of seeds.
Well, it'd be 1 ounce of nuts or seeds
Oh,
typically
or
with a quarter to
seeds.
half an avocado,
Uh,
especially for people with weight control issues. If you're not challenged with weight control and you're on a higher caloric diet, for example, athletes might be burning 3,500 calories a day, whereas an older person might only be burning 1,600 calories a day. So the amount of those richer foods would obviously be a little bit more in the young athlete or the heavy manual worker because it's a percentage of calories, not just an absolute, quantity. So we have to understand there's a little bit of flexibility in there, but here's how you can tell. If you're overweight and you're losing 2 pounds a week as a female or 3 pounds a week as a male, you've probably got the balance pretty good. If you're at weight and you're maintaining optimum weight, that's a good sign. If you're underweight and you're slowly regaining weight, you're probably doing okay. But if you're fat and you're not getting thinner, or you're gaining or losing too much weight, you might have to modify the dietary specifics a little bit to try to kind of get it tuned in. And for people that are having trouble kind of figuring out how to fine tune the little subtleties, that's where sometimes it's good to do a consult with a doctor who's experienced with people getting well. And whether it's a lifestyle medicine doctor, it's a doctor from TrueNorth Health, because they can sometimes help you kind of fine tune things just a little bit in order to get that success that you're looking for.
all right. I think I have to give up some of my avocados. So thank you for that. Now, there are a lot of people out there who tout the benefits of salt. And like Gabriel Cousins says that you should eat salt from mineral beds, unprocessed salt, and he recommends 1.5 teaspoons a day.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts
Well,
on
I
the
think
different
that
types of
again,
salts?
sodium is an essential nutrient. If you don't get enough sodium, that's a major problem. In fact, sodium is so important, you're designed to detect it at very small quantities. That's one of the reasons you'll eat vegetables and things like that. That's why Swiss chard appeals, et cetera, because the part of it is the sodium stimulating, your neuroreceptors. So salt's a good thing. In the amount of salt that's present in a whole plant food diet turns out to be that 500 to 1,000 milligrams. So you don't need to add salt to the food any more than you need to add sugar to the food or add oil to the food in order to get the quantity and quality of nutrients you need. American Heart Association says you need about 500 milligrams a day. This diet typically has around 1,000 milligrams a day. A little bit more if people are eating some contamination in the form of processed foods. If they're eating say a corn tortilla, it's going to have some extra sodium in there. There's a little bit of buffer in there that you can often get away with. But when you start eating the higher amounts of salt, the added salt to the diet, then you get into the dietary pleasure trap. And so I would disagree with people that are advocating added additional salt to the diet under the false premise that they're not getting enough sodium. And the reason they may be confused is that many vegans are not eating a healthy diet. They're eating a lot of foods. For example, people that are drinking alcohol, eating soda pop, these are not necessarily sources of sodium. If they're getting most of their calories from sugar and refined carbohydrates and not eating vegetables, they may not be getting enough of many different nutrients. But people that are eating all of their calories from whole plant foods find that the quantity and quality of sodium they need is met by their diet. There are some rare exceptions. For example, people that have hypoparathyroidism that don't produce mineralocorticoids may not absorb sodium well from the diet. You may need to supplement that diet with some additional sodium. But for the average person, the less salt they eat, the less fat they're going to be, the less blood pressure they're going to have, the less arthritis they're going to have, the healthier they're going to do. So for the vast majority of people, adding salt to the diet is not desirable. Now, is it true that eating some of these salts they recommend are better than eating refined sodium chloride? Yeah, but only to the degree that they're contaminated with other minerals. So there's less sodium per volume. That doesn't mean that you have to add salt to the diet. It doesn't mean something that's less bad is good. It's just less bad. And so when people are addicted to the artificial stimulus of sodium in the diet, they can't stand the disgusting taste of whole natural foods at first. It takes people about a month on a low sodium diet to neuroadapt to a low salt diet. In fact, we did a study I'll be discussing in my next talk where we actually showed the actual change in sensitivity to salt and sugar after fasting. After a short period of fasting, people have a profound change in how foods taste. And good foods start to taste good. And now all of a sudden, what used to be highly desirable, that high salt soup that you might have had at a restaurant, now is actually have a burning response because you can actually detect what's there.
And Michael Greger talks about moving or recommends moving to potassium chloride if you like the taste of salt. What are your thoughts on that
I
from a
disagree
strategy?
in that regard. It is true that it's less bad, but the chloride still has a negative effect. And the biggest danger to doing that, taking these salt substitutes, is that you never allow your body to neuroadapt to the lower salt intake. Once you've done a fast or you've done this diet for enough period of weeks, good foods start to actually taste good. You don't need, whether it's potassium chloride or sodium chloride, added to the diet in order to induce a pleasure response. And the tendency to overeat is also reduced. And so we want to stop trying to bang on our perverted nervous systems in order to be able to make short-term gain and look more towards long-term benefit. So yes, shifting from sodium chloride to potassium chloride may be a step in the right direction, but it's not necessarily the long-term goal, which is to get to the point where you actually enjoy the flavor of whole plant foods as they are, rather than as we adulterate them.
Thank you. So I know that or my understanding is that a strategy to get people to drink more in a bar is to give them salty pretzels, right? What is the strategy of a restaurant to give free bread, which fills up the stomach, or free chips and salsa type of thing?
Well, it's very important that you understand the cost per calorie of bread is very low. And the cost per calorie of the dead decaying flesh and the other stuff that they're serving is very high. They want you satiated and satisfied. Nobody wants to go to a restaurant, spend a bunch of money, and then go home hungry. And so they want to fill you up on all kinds of cheap, refined carbohydrates and processed foods that will be highly appealing, so that when they come to eat the more expensive products, you'll feel full and satisfied. And then, in order to get you to buy even more material, they'll give you a hyper concentrated substance called dessert, which is something that's even higher caloric density. So it can bang on your system, though, even though you're completely full. If you give you something with chocolate all over it, then it'll stimulate your taste response so that you can shove in just a little bit more. And then you can pay another bunch of money for that. And then on top of that, we'll give you some alcohol afterwards, because there's always room for alcohol because it has no fiber, just a bunch of calories. That's why men get those really attractive beer bellies and the plumbers crack when they drink alcohol. That's why they make the pants come up even higher now, because the women were growing crazy. And so they're having to make the jeans come up higher to hide that plumber's crack.
Thank you for that visual. So you were talking about soft drinks, and my understanding is that kids have kind of skewed soda for these energy drinks now, and they're drinking that a lot more. Tell me about the dangers or your thoughts on energy drinks.
Well, it's interesting. They used to put cocaine in the Coca-Cola as the stimulant, but now they found a better drug, more addictive. It's called caffeine. And if a little is good, a lot must be a lot better. And so now what they're doing is they're competing to see who can have the most caffeine and the most sugar into the substances. And of course, we're turning our kids into little addicts. And so, that's what happens.
You mentioned chocolate. I didn't realize how calorically dense chocolate was. And I've been known to eat some chocolate from time to time. What about cacao? People put that in their smoothie. They're told it's very good for them. How does
Again, there's a lot of things that are less bad. Almost everything's less bad than the chocolate, but that doesn't necessarily, again, make it a healthy substance. Again, it's a highly processed food. Most of these have a lot of oil and salt and sugar in order to make them palatable.
I'm
So,
referring to the cacao nibs that you'd like that a lot of people eat for their health. They have no, they don't. They're obviously broken down, and I'm sure they're processed to some degree, but they don't have added sugar and salt and stuff in them.
right. Well, yeah, again, most of these substances, in order to make them palatable, have either salt, oil, or sugar. It's just depending on what you're using the carrier agent to drive to the palate. What we're advocating is whole foods. So rather than ultra processed foods like cacao nips and other things. And again, you can look at, now we have vegan burgers, and people will argue that they're better than meat, and they may very well. In fact, I know John McDougall used to argue that even though they may not be health promoting products in the sense they're full of salt and processed food and other stuff, he believed that in order to save the planet, we had to adopt a vegetarian approach. And so that anything that got people eating plants, may not benefit them health-wise, but it'll at least save the planet. My approach is a little bit different. I'm not benevolent like he was. I'm not worried about saving the planet. I'm worried about saving my patients' health. I'm looking for my individual patients to live a long and healthy life. That's my target. And so I'm not willing to say, well, it's good for the planet, so we don't care about you. What I'm saying is, what's going to help you live a long and healthy life? And that's not going to be eating ultra processed burgers, vegan though they may be. So we're going to try to encourage our patients to make every calorie they shove in their face whole plant foods. And if they do that, they win. They lose the weight, they achieve their health goals, and they're able to extend the quantity and quality of their life. And to the degree that we compromise that with ultra processed foods, healthier than the other stuff that it may be, it's still a compromise. And so, I know not everybody's going to want this extreme radical message, but for those that are serious about living the longest and healthiest life possible, I think that a whole plant food, SOS-free diet, exercise, sleep, and periodic fasting are the answer to that.
So you talked about dopamine, and now dopamine gets released for many reasons. I guess
Mostly food and sex.
right, but no, agreed. So it's also there's the phone. Yeah, those are like yes, those are some of the easiest and most satisfying. So the phone and stuff like that. And people are addicted to their phone, and they're addicted to their food and all that type of stuff. So even, so in addition to the food, you have all this stimulation around us. How do people in this modern day life detox from dopamine so they're not dopamine addicts?
Well, I think one of the best way to reboot the system is fasting. Fasting is, and there's a reason that, the Jews and the Jains, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and the Christians don't agree on everything. But there is one thing that they all have deep respect and admiration for, and that's fasting. And fasting, it's like rebooting a computer. You know how you're using your computer and it becomes corrupted and it doesn't work, and you don't know. You turn the damn thing off, you turn it on, and for some reason it's working again. You've you've cleared the memory, you've done whatever it is that rebooting that computer does. Fasting is analogous to that. When you do on a fast and you get the appropriate rest that goes along with it, and you come back off the fast, hopefully on a high vegetable cellulose diet to reboot the microbiome, it's like rebooting your whole system. The taste, the palate reboots, the internal systems, the gut microbiome reboots. And so I think that's a very effective way. The other option is to just adopt a health promoting diet and lifestyle and do it diligently. And if you do it a long enough period of time, you also recalibrate. It takes about a month to recalibrate on sodium. It takes about 3 months to recalibrate from a high fat diet. So, it does take time, and fasting makes it happen faster.
Would fasting and clearing your dopamine response out through dietary fasting influence things? I mean, there's my understanding is, the cell phones, there's pornography, there's a whole bunch of different things that people are addicted to. Would that have an impact on that, or is that a different
Well,
mechanism?
it actually, one of the reasons you see it happen during fasting is because we restrain from those activities during fasting. So I don't know if the fasting physiologically itself, or anything you do, like for example, if you go camping and don't take the cell phone, you do tend to recalibrate. Um,
Okay.
so if it happens during fasting, we might attribute it to fasting, but that may be an error of attribution, because I think it works just as well, just as quickly, whether you're fasting or just doing anything else that gets you free from those overstimulating systems. And it is interesting to see how we just shift from one addiction to another. And that's my reluctance at advocating programs that are somewhat less bad and saying, well, we'll give you potassium chloride instead of something. No, we want to break the addictions. We want to get ourselves free. We want to put ourselves in what we call as a position of power, to where we're in control of our own domain. We're making consciously the decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to get headaches from your halo being too tight, that you're never going to make an exception, that you don't engage in behaviors that maybe not the most health promoting at some given time. But you have to know yourself well enough. For example, some people can have a drink but not become a drunk. But if you're a drunk, that's not you. If you're a drunk and you have a drink, you end up waking up under the Golden Gate Bridge naked, wondering how you got there eventually. Some
How
people
did
can
you
have a
know?
piece of this or a piece of that, and they can let it go and they're not thinking about it. But some people, if they have a little, they're going to have a lot. It's called the pleasure trap. And if you're vulnerable to the pleasure trap, nothing is better than something. It's easier sometimes to just not do it than to tease yourself. Some people are vulnerable to something else called the ego trap. Whereas if they can have nothing, they feel deprived. And so it's important for them they need to be able to participate to some limited degree. And they may be able to do that and deal with their ego trap issues without necessarily becoming vulnerable to the pleasure trap. But many people are vulnerable to both. And this is where the problem comes in. If they have a little, they want a lot, but if they have none, they feel deprived. And so they're the most vulnerable to the fact that everywhere you go, people are going to try to give you what you want, not what you need. And what you want is to indulge in the pleasure trap without being caught in it. And what you need is to learn how to escape the pleasure trap and learn your life. And that's why we recommend people read our book, The Pleasure Trap, because it's a disturbing book that tells them not what they want to hear, but what they need to know in order to get and stay healthy.
It reminds me of smoking cigarettes, where if you don't have to worry about like triggering your addiction if you're already addicted, if you don't have any, but if you have one, that's when you actually have the battle.
Exactly. That's a classic example of a pleasure trap. And the problem is that's true for some people with things like chocolate and sugar. If they don't have any, they adapt to it and they're doing fine. But then if they go and have that piece of chocolate cake and the next day they think, well, I'm better now. I can have a little bit. I'll control it. I'll regulate it. And before long, they've gained their weight back, and we have to take them back to the center and fast them again.
You're reading my soul. So, you spoke about statins. Dr. Kim Williams and T. Colin Campbell had a little disagreement once on a panel a few years ago, on efficacy of statins. Where do you fall down on that? And if you can explain your thoughts.
Well, I think that in the extreme patients of hypercholesteremia, you can try to make a case that statins will lower cholesterol. I don't think there's any challenge statins will lower cholesterol. The question is, it will make people live longer. And even conventional authorities will tell you you have to treat, several hundred people in order for somebody to get a net all-cause benefit. What I see in practice is people that are taking statin medications because they're told that's what they need to do, suffering significantly from joint pain and other problems. When we get them off the statins and get rid of the joint pain, and they're willing to do the diet, their cholesterol levels drop precipitously without the need for statin medication. In fact, in some things that even dietary change alone won't reverse, for example, lipoprotein little a, I'll be sharing some original research that we did on lipoprotein little a, that even in vegetarians, that the vegetarian diet will not drop lipoprotein little a typically, it does drop with fasting, and sometimes significantly. So even 10 days of fasting can result in a 40% reduction in longstanding vegetarian. I've had a 100-point drop with just 5 days of fasting in one long-term vegan that's a compliant vegan. So there are things you can do to lower statins besides take statin medications. And there's some very serious question about the actual net all-cause mortality reduction, particularly in people on healthy diets. Some people have higher cholesterol than others. It's a bell curve. And so the idea that everybody that has elevated cholesterol without other risk factors, without inflammatory, ketone reactive protein elevations or other risk factors, will have a net benefit from statins, I think is a mistake. And I imagine Dr. Campbell would make that same argument that, if you look at that literature carefully and you sequester it out, the question is, do people with elevated cholesterol all benefit from statins? And you may find a difference between people doing the conventional thing that causes hypertension and people that are just congenital hypercholesteremic but don't have the associated risk factors. I would argue for most people against statins unless they're not willing to do the diet, lifestyle, exercise, and other factors. For those people, you might be able to make, as Dr. Williams' case, a net benefit for some of those people at the highest risk factors. But for most of our people that are willing to make diet and lifestyle changes, we're going to get people off statin medication. We get everybody off statin medications in order to fast. And then it would only be the people that wouldn't respond to diet and lifestyle change that you would consider whether medication intervention was warranted or not.
So I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying, because you gave a lot of information very quickly there. With regard to when you fasted certain people, there was one person at least that was a compliant vegan, presumably eating healthy, and you were able to lower his cholesterol by 100 points.
Well, we were able to lower cholesterol level and maybe more significantly, the lipoprotein little a. Lipoprotein little a is a congenital marker for cardiovascular disease risk. And it's so resistant to change, it will not drop with drugs, for example, that the Social Security Medicare will only pay for one test a lifetime. Because they say, once you know it's elevated, there's no point in testing it again because nothing changes it. Well, what we've shown is that one thing does change it, and that's fasting. So a vegetarian diet alone won't change it, but the combination with fasting and the vegetarian diet does. And as far as cholesterol is concerned, yes, these people that have congenital hypercholesteremia, but no other risk factors, their SED rates are normal, they don't have cardiovascular disease, their carotid ultrasounds are good, but they have congenitally higher levels of cholesterol. Even those congenital hypercholesterol levels will drop with not only vegetarian diet, but even more so with fasting and exercise. So most people, we can bring their cholesterol down enough that even the people that promote statin medications would agree that they're no longer at risk for cardiovascular disease.
How long of a fast was required to lower their lipoprotein little a, and same with the cholesterol?
Well, the first one we did was actually a famous vegetarian. It was 10 days. And it was a 40% reduction. And he's talked about that publicly, about his own experience. And he was vegetarian, but he was eating a little bit of hyper-processed foods. Weight went up, blood pressure went up. We entirely normalized that as expected, but also surprisingly dropped his lipoprotein little a 40%. And then we had a woman who was 78, lifetime vegan, at weight, looking good, but always ran high cholesterol and lipoprotein little a, no other risk factors, no cardiovascular disease. But her lipoprotein little a dropped 100 points after 5 days of fasting and a 40-point drop in cholesterol. So we know that there are things and now we've been doing it on all kinds of people, and we're finding significant drops of lipoprotein little a with fasting. There's something about fasting that we're trying to figure out now that will drop this up till now was considered untreatable. Risk factor for cardiovascular disease.
What's the minimal length of of fasting required to see?
Well, so far we've seen big changes even with 5 days of fasting in a vegan. Now the problem is that's in vegetarians and vegans. In conventional people, you're going to need to fast them longer because they're fat and sick. And so you're not likely to see as quick a change in conventional people. The other thing is that you have to remember not everybody's willing to do really radical things like eat well, exercise, go to bed on time, do fasting. For those people that are going to insist on living on a greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diet, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, not exercising, I'm not arguing that you might not be able to generate a net benefit for some people using these medications. There clearly is with blood pressure medications. For example, blood pressure medications, when people's systolic blood pressure is over 160, will lower their risk of stroke. There's not much question about that. It will increase the risk of dying from other things, but it'll lower their risk of stroke enough to offset the increased death rate. So there's a net benefit for people with elevated hypercholesteremia. But having said that, we did a study with 174 consecutive people with high blood pressure, and 174 of the 174 lowered their pressure enough to eliminate the need for medication. So we don't see people with essential hypertension that we can't normalize their blood pressure if they're willing to do the fasting, diet, and exercise. And so there's virtually nobody that we're putting back on blood pressure medications long term. A study we recently did with Mayo Clinic, 26 of the 27 people achieved entirely normal blood pressure and maintained that. One of the 27 needed to go back on a half dose of medication after the first fast. And I venture to bet that person, once we get the second fast, will resolve it as well. And what's interesting is 76% of those people at 1 year had maintained their weight loss, and the majority were still normotensive without medication a year later, which means that at least highly compliant people can make and sustain diet and lifestyle changes in treating this leading contributing cause of death and disability.
So actually that was my follow-up question, which is how long is the lowering of the cholesterol and the lipid protein little a sustained for after a fast? That's one question. And how drastic of a difference is their diet required to be in order to
Well, that was what was exciting about the vegetarian that we were talking about, these two vegetarians, because they were already on vegetarian diets. They were already doing quite well. They had a few pounds, it was a little bit of, fine tuning. But the bottom line is that has sustained now. We've got 6-month follow-ups on them, and it's not gone back up with refeeding and realimentation after fasting. So I think the question is, are they willing to stay on a healthy diet, healthier diet now than the healthy diet they were on before? Understand, at their worst, they were still better than everybody else. It was just, they'd gotten a little looser on the edges, enough to gain a little bit of weight and make some changes. So that little fine tuning was enough to be reversed with fasting. And that isn't reversed with diet alone. For example, Dr. Weiss has been tracking a lot of people on vegetarian diets and tracking their lipoprotein little a and not seeing really substantial changes there. It's the fasting that seems to generate the really big, significant changes, in addition to the vegetarian diet that we're doing with everybody. So even people already on the diet get additional benefit from fasting when it comes to those measurements. That's the point I was making.
If somebody maintain their diet, like they didn't really change their diet drastically afterwards, would those benefits of reduced cholesterol go away?
No, they are sustained to the degree that people maintain this higher level of weight control and dietary compliance.
Okay.
So in fact, what typically happens is they get additional benefit. It's just slower. So let's say they're running 280, they drop to 220 after fasting. At 6 weeks, they're still 220, but then if you look at them a year, they're oftentimes down at 210 or 200. They may never be at 150 because it's a bell curve. There are some people that just make more cholesterol than other people, but that doesn't necessarily put them at risk for cardiovascular disease. More sensitive indicators might be things like cardio CRP, the high sensitivity C-reactive protein that measures inflammation. That might be a more sensitive indicator than would be, say, cholesterol. Cholesterol is more useful epidemiologically for society as a whole, not necessarily that one individual.
Thank you. So T. Colin Campbell, he talks extensively about cholesterol in his latest book called The Future of Nutrition. And he says that dietary cholesterol does not contribute to serum cholesterol. Right. And that things like dietary cholesterol, as well as saturated fat, he said saturated fat is actually quite neutral. It's really a stand-in for animal protein.
right.
and it's the animal
So,
protein that causes these issues. What is your thoughts on that
well, I have to
analysis?
say, T. Colin Campbell, who is actually the co-author of some of our studies, he's one of my heroes. I mean, he's one of the most courageous, most intelligent people I know. He's the guy that I tend to run our stuff by to make sure we're not saying something stupid or making errors when it comes to nutrition science. I have the utmost respect for him, and I completely agree with him. I think that he's accurately representing the scientific literature. Now, that doesn't mean that we're right. It just means that given the information that's available, I think his conclusions are the most logical. But there's definitely some controversy because not all the data agrees with each other. So, we do our best to interpret, contrasting different bits of information. But when it comes to what I recommend everybody read T. Colin Campbell's books, including his newest book, and including the one that he's working on right now that's going to be coming out that's really going to piss people off because he really gets in there and name names and tells the truth. So I think
Yeah.
that you can't go wrong interpreting the material that Dr. Campbell is presenting because he does a really good job and a very unbiased, viewpoint. I mean, he's coming from a scientific, not from a clinical edge debate or whatever. I trust his judgment, and I respect the information that he's presented.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I was talking to Colin Campbell yesterday, and yeah, he gave us the name of what the working title, which is The Whole Truth, which is perfect for him, right? To
Yeah.
kind of conclude everything
Yeah,
up.
and I told him we're going to all chip in and get him a Kevlar vest because I think when this next book comes out, it's going to be a lot of people really pissed off at
I,
him.
I'm amazed he made it this far with everything he
Yeah.
says in these books. He's
Yeah. Well, and,
great.
it's interesting because he tells
Great.
his story. He was the first scientist to ever isolate dioxin, the active agent in Agent Orange, in his career, and got a huge exposure to it. And the way that we became friends and became acquainted with each other was that he chose to come to TrueNorth Health Center to fast to deal with his dioxin toxicity. And to make a long story short, he went from being in real deep trouble, this is many years ago, to being the guy he is today, writing books at 92.
I
He attributes at least some of that benefit to reversing this problem that he had with fasting. He was already on a plant-based diet and stuff. So that was a great experience that we had. And he was instrumental in a publication of our particularly early studies, medically supervised water-only fasting in the treatment of hypertension. He was the guy that helped drive the boat to help us get those papers published and has been incredibly inspirational to our practice and operation.
Yeah, the intellectual agility that he shows in The Future of Nutrition, his last book, is stunning, and I don't think most people at their peak could write anything, could even make a sentence as coherent as what he does through that
He
book.
is truly an exceptional human being and a brilliant scientist.
So, this past year we lost Dr. John McDougall. He was a huge figure in plant-based movement. And clearly you're a fan of his. In honor of him, I'd love for you to just speak real briefly about the contributions that he made to the plant-based
Mhm.
movement and getting the message out.
Well, I knew Dr. McDougall for my entire professional practice career because he moved to town where we are in Santa Rosa just shortly after we opened practice. And he was actually our first medical doctor that we used to help people manage, medical management issues in our patients. And actually, years later, when he retired from seeing patients, he turned his practice over to the doctors at our facility. And I'm on his board of directors. He has a nonprofit board of directors, and I've been a member of his board of directors, for decades. And I have deep respect for Dr. McDougall. And even the areas that we have some differences, they're really more philosophical differences. For example, Dr. McDougall wanted to save the world. And so he believed everybody had to go on a vegetarian diet in order to help save the planet, that the effect of animal husbandry was more pervasive than internal combustion engine even. And so, that was the important thing. And that the more extreme version of the diet that I advocate, he believed was detrimental to that progress, that it was harder to do exclusively whole plant food SOS-free diet. Not everybody would do that, but everybody, he believed, should do at least a vegetarian diet. So he was much more flexible with sodium and sugar and trying to appeal to people's palate and taste, not to recognizing everybody wasn't going to fast and get to the point where they could enjoy a whole plant food diet, that a lot of people weren't willing to do that. So therefore, to save the planet, we had to advocate a more flexible diet. And he would send us people that didn't respond. For example, if somebody's blood pressure didn't come down enough, he would actually apologize to them and say, I'm so sorry to do this to you, but you need to go up there to Goldhamer's place. We're only a mile away from where his clinic was. And he said, you have to do that, and good luck to you, because he knew that he was asking them to really do a lot. Because most people would get well with his more modified approach, his more flexible approach, his approach that was more amenable to wide stream acceptance. And I totally respected that. I appreciated that he was there doing that. I'm glad that there's lifestyle medicine doctors out there trying to save the planet. And that doesn't mean that we agree completely on what the optimum approach was. So, and there's also a difference, optimum approach for an individual or optimum approach for society. And you have these same arguments that come in with things like vaccination and immunization. Although you might be able to make a societal case for some kind of drug intervention, it may not be in the best interest of you or your kid. And so then you have to have that. So he was one of those people that really did have the world's best interest at heart. And he wasn't, narrowly focused like I might be to just the one patient in front of me. And so I had a lot of respect for him, even though we might have a different recommendation for a specific situation. His goals were much broader, and he did so much. He so powerfully influenced me with his first book, the McDougall program. Excuse me. He was really one of the first ones I saw that really went to the scientific literature and referenced it and gave you access to how he formed his conclusions. And it really was, his best interpretation of the scientific literature that drove his behavior. And so he had high integrity, wasn't afraid of anything, was completely oblivious to being socially manipulated. He said what he believed. He would fight for his fights.
Yes,
he didn't take crap from anybody.
Done some
and
funny
regardless
things.
of the consequences. He was a real hero.
Including calling some people, names or.
Oh yeah, he was definitely he was a charged up guy.
Outspoken.
He was the kind of the Draymond Green of of nutritional medicine.
What did you think about his main thesis that starch was so vital to the diet?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any question. We are animals that have lived on some type of starch or other. There's got to be some source of glucose for us, whether it's potatoes or rice or whichever variety of starch you chose. And I don't know if it matters that much which vegetable-based or grain-based starches you use as a staple. Clearly, human beings have used that as a foundation of our diets from the beginning of time. I tend to emphasize more the need for lots of fruits and vegetables in the diet, just because I find the lower caloric density helps people with the overeating issue. And so, even though we were advocating pretty much the same kind of diet, I put more emphasis on vegetables and fruit than he did. I also advocated an SOS-free diet, which he didn't disagree was a healthful diet. It was just that it was much harder to adapt to. And, you could give people food that looks and tastes much like conventional food with McDougall program type of an approach. And that works for most people, but for the people with high blood pressure or people that had specific health issues, they had to also turn up the diet a little bit further. And he acknowledged that. He put out a book, that specifically talked about, if you're having trouble with weight and you're not doing well with the bread and this, you can tighten up the screw and do the stricter version of it, which actually much closer to what we advocate routinely.
So if somebody's blood, their labs look good and they're asymptomatic, they don't have any visible issues, no pains or anything like that, is good enough with
I don't think
to
so. I think what we're beginning to discover is that the people that get the most benefit from the really strict diet and the use of fasting are the healthy people that really want to stay healthy and spend the last 20 years of their life fully functional, cognitively intact. And, they're not satisfied to just be okay today, but they're really thinking long term. And that extra little bit of adherence, like we're seeing in these patients that are vegetarians, but we tighten up the screws and we do a little fasting. Now, all of a sudden, their long-term cardiometabolic risk factors drop even further. So yeah, I think people will do okay. But if your goal is to live into your 80s or 90s and be fully functional until you reach that, I think that we can do even better than the okay vegetarian diet. I think we can tighten it up, exclusively whole plant foods, SOS free, with periodic fasting. And I think if you do that, you'll be more like the patients we're having 30 and 40-year follow-ups on that are doing right well to the very end of their existence.
So what I'm hearing is even if you're asymptomatic now and your blood labs look great, it's in the long term you are gonna become symptomatic if you're not as clean as you can be.
In my experience, we were doing a study looking at exactly that issue. We wanted to find out, did fasting benefit people that were already healthy and had good looking labs? And we started trying to recruit for that study. And inevitably, the people that were coming in that thought they were healthy, they weren't overweight, they had normal blood pressure. But when we actually did really detailed cardiometabolic risk factor assessment, they had risk factors, even though they were small, and it was probably going to take a long time for them to show up as a problem. We got so desperate to enroll enough people in this study, we finally had to start recruiting staff. The people that live at the TrueNorth Health Center and eat this diet day in and day out. There's where we found people that met all the various cardiometabolic risk factors. After we were done, they all met those standards. And what's interesting is many of them are able to sustain those levels. Even though they may not be 100% compliant with the diet, they're doing well enough that they're able to sustain those issues. Those are rare people. Those are only a tiny fraction of the population. So there may be people that are so healthy, they don't even need the extra boost that we give people with the periodic fasting or something. That's possible. But those are so rare, it's hard to actually collect enough of them to do a study.
Do you have a list that you maintain of people who are willing to volunteer for the fasts for future studies?
Yes, in fact, we'll be announcing this soon, but we'll be enrolling in what's called our Navigator study. We plan to enroll 2,000 people that they will be enrolled for the rest of their life. And what we'll be doing is administering yearly testing where they'll be able to get access to some of this state-of-the-art lab, and also adherence. We have validated adherence questionnaires so we can get an idea of what they're actually doing. And we're going to track them forever. And basically, we'll find out at the end of their lifespan, were we successful at avoiding the last 20 years of debility that actually are so common now with people? Do they not have the stroke and heart attacks? So they don't end up in the nursing home and they maintain good cognitive capacity. And we'll be testing those 2,000 people forever until we actually get that question answered. And that's the only way to really answer that with certainty, is how much benefit and how strict you have to be. Well, we're going to find out.
How would people go about letting you know that they're interested in?
Well, if they go to our website and register on our website so they get our free newsletter, they will be bombarded with promotion of this once we announce it. Right now, we have a couple things we have to put in place first. We've invested a huge amount of money in a state-of-the-art electronic medical record system that's built on Salesforce that we're going to be able to use to track accurately all of the data that we're going to be collecting. That we're about to put into, they're supposed to go live this month. Once it's live, we've got the bugs worked out. We'll send out a newsletter and we'll ask all of our affiliates to let people know, for people that really are interested in living a long and healthy life, enroll in this study, and we'll make it so attractive to you that you won't want to not participate.
Will this require them to come in periodically for fasting?
No, they'll have options of whether it's remote fasting supervision, coming to the center and fasting, or not doing fasting at all, because the people that choose not to fast will be comparing to the people that do choose to do that periodically. So they can do whatever they want to do. The only thing they'll be obligated to is honestly reporting what they're doing. And so, and we'll be making access to lab available. We'll be making access to these questionnaires available on a yearly basis. It'll be a minimal commitment in terms of documentation, but we will plan to continue to do that. And we'll incentivize them by giving them access to ongoing support, education, et cetera, that'll make it attractive enough that we think people will want to do that project for the rest of their life.
All right. Well, I think maybe we should send out an email here at The Real Truth About Health and let them know, because I'm sure you'll have plenty of people who want to register for that.
Yeah.
So now, in order to keep this practical, this lifestyle practical, because I eat plant-based, I'm gluten-free, I don't drink alcohol, I don't drink caffeine. It becomes quite limiting socially. How do you go out? I mean, when I go out to eat, I'm not perfect when I go out to eat.
Yeah.
How do you suggest you deal with going to a restaurant?
Sure. So, this is a huge problem. It's become a little bit less of a problem than it used to be. It used to be nobody even knew, what you were talking about if you were trying to get a vegan meal or something like that. So it's really not much problem eating vegan. You can almost always avoid meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products nowadays, because there's everybody wants to, there's enough vegans out there that they're trying to have something to accommodate them. It's not terribly difficult to avoid oil nowadays. You can get sauce on the side. You can do things to try to minimize your exposure to salt and sugar or oil and sugar. It's exceptionally difficult to avoid sodium contamination. So if you are really salt sensitive, that might be a major problem. If you're not, it may be that may be where you're going to get a little contamination exposure, and hopefully you can dilute that down and not make it a big problem, especially if you're not having to eat out too much. Here's what I do though, because I have to travel a lot. I do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of traveling. One is I always try to stay at a place that has at least a microwave or a kitchenette. And nowadays you can get almost everywhere you stay in hotels or motels and stuff, you can get, so that way you can make a baked potato, or you can do a yam, or you can go to these places called grocery stores and get stuff. And some of the stuff is like in its own container. It's called fresh fruit, banana, peel and eat, apples. So you can get things like oatmeal are easy to make oats. And, so fresh fruit, oatmeal, you can carry, usually take some nuts or seeds, these kinds of things to make it easy to get through those few days of traveling. In restaurants, a lot of times, if you look at the menu and you just figure out what's in the kitchen, you can usually get a baked potato or a baked yam. You can get steamed vegetables. If it's a restaurant that actually has a chef, you can call ahead and say, look, could you just make me a big bucket of salad with lemon only, no dressing, make me some steamed vegetables, get me a couple baked potatoes. You can usually get enough calories from a place if you plan ahead a little bit. I remember one time I was in the Midwest, though, and I had gotten bumped a few times on the plane, so I didn't get in until about 10 p.m. And everything was closed. All the grocery stores were closed, except there's a 24-hour place called Chuck's Steakhouse. And it was one of those places that if you ate the 40-ounce steak in an hour, it was free. But I thought, well, I'll find something in there that, I can get. But, all their vegetables were like, they had creamed corn and they had, hash browns, but they didn't actually have any vegetables or whole food. But I noticed on the special board that they had baked potatoes as an option. And I asked the waitress, I said, are the baked potatoes big or little? And she goes, well, they're just regular, regular sized potatoes. And I said, well, I'd like to get 5 baked potatoes, nothing on them. And she laughed and she said, yeah, that's right. What are you going to have? And I said, no, I want to have 5 baked potatoes, nothing on it. And she said, oh, and she kind of backed away from me. And I could see her talking to people. And so she brought me these 5 baked potatoes, which actually have about 500 calories, about the same as the guy with a steak sandwich next to me. And there were people coming out from the kitchen to see if this guy was really going to eat 5 baked potatoes. So you adapt, you adjust. I remember I got hired in Texas to speak to a medical group of diabetologists, and I give them a presentation on diabetes. They were serving, these guys were, 200 physicians, all overweight. They were serving them pulled pork sandwiches, chocolate cake. There was nothing to eat except they had some really attractive carved bell peppers that were set up as decoration on the table. And if you took the pins out, you could get them free from and they were delicious. They worked out quite well. But nonetheless, I give this talk and you could see they were very uncomfortable. Physicians were very uncomfortable listening to this stuff about diet and fasting and eating well. And the guy come up to me afterwards. He was a physician, at least 75 pounds overweight, huge guy. And he said, I've been treating diabetics for 25 years and I'd never seen one get well. He said, maybe I should do this diet stuff myself. And I'm thinking, this guy's been treating diabetes for 25 years. He's never had a single patient recover. And I'm thinking, if it was me, I'd be thinking, maybe it's me. But It didn't even dawn on me because it's not part of the paradigm. So traveling is a challenge, but you can overcome that challenge if you think ahead, take some stuff with you, get a place that has a kitchenette. If we're traveling, if we go to a place, we'll oftentimes get a place that has a kitchen. Amazing, you save more money making your own meals than the extra cost of maybe getting that bed and breakfast place or whatever. And oftentimes we end up doing quite well. You get a chance to go to the farmers markets if they have them, get a chance to track down maybe the one restaurant that actually serves some healthy food. And also, once you get used to this diet, you realize, you can skip a meal or two and you're still going to be okay.
Well, thank you so much. That concludes our time here. So it's absolutely a pleasure talking to you. I am gonna register and look out for those emails, and I would love to participate in something like that. Just a real quick question, just like a yes or no answer. Someone put, I think they said, what's his website? And it says healthpromoting.com. Is that you?
healthpromoting.com or TrueNorthHealth.com goes to the same place.
Okay, all right. Just want to make sure that was accurate information. All right, great. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. If we can unmute the audience, please.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Information.